Hi everyone, this is going to be my second video on my series on the genealogy of morality by Nietzsche from 1887. In the first one, we looked at the preface and Nietzsche's method of genealogy as opposed to history or evolution. And in this new video, I want to talk about part one or treatise one, which is where Nietzsche introduces the very famous distinction between what he calls noble morality and slave morality. So let's jump into the material. Remember that in the preface to the book, Nietzsche talked about other thinkers and how they write about the history of morality, focusing in particular on the works of his friend Paul Ray. And in part one, Nietzsche opens up by making more specific where people like Paul Ray go wrong, where they leave the path that could have led them to a genealogy and actually deviates them towards a purely simple or a merely evolutionary historical account. And the reason is that they don't think about morality in the right way, and therefore they go looking for its origins in the wrong spot. And where people like Paul Ray go astray is in internalizing, in particular, the idea that the goodness of an action or the badness of an action is determined from the point of view of the recipient, and this is important, the recipient of a moral act. So let me give you a concrete example. Let's say that I take a $20 bill out of my pocket and I give it to somebody that I think is in need. This is a moral act, an act of charity or of benevolence, whatever you might want to call it. Now, in this case, we would say that that act is morally good because it enhances the well-being of the recipient, right? It makes them better off. It gives them an opportunity to pursue new projects. It allows them to buy some food, whatever the case might be. But it means that we determine the goodness or the badness from the standpoint of the recipient, of how it affects and changes the inner life and the outer possibilities of the recipient. Conversely, if I do something that is morally bad, like I take out a broom and I hit somebody over the head with it for no reason, again, we would say that the person that is the recipient of this action would be entitled to say that was a morally problematic because you harmed me, because you took away my sense of dignity, whatever the case might be. Here, it depends on your specific moral framework for thinking about what is morally good or morally bad. Either way, it's from the perspective of the recipient that the moral valence of an act is determined. And Nietzsche says, once you begin from that assumption, it means that you've already taken a side. You've already taken the side of one of the two different systems of moral valuation that have been in competition historically. And if you're already partisan to one worldview, you won't be able to tell the history of morality, which is the history of the interaction between these two systems of thought. And this is where he famously transitions into describing these two systems of value, which he calls the noble morality versus the slave morality. Or conversely, he calls it the chivalric aristocratic system of moral valuation, to be more precise, and the priestly system of moral valuation. But for short, we can just call them noble and slave because that's terminology that Nietzsche uses and that is in the secondary literature. Now, we have to think about what he means by these two very quickly. In short, the morality of the nobles, which Nietzsche associates with the ancient Greeks, is one rooted in the dichotomy between the good and the bad. So if you think about the moral universe of the Greeks in their chivalric aristocratic fullness, it would be a system of moral values where things are good or bad, but the meaning of those terms is very precise. Nietzsche says, for the nobles, the good is the strong, that which is healthy, that which enhances your power, and ultimately acts as a mechanism for self-affirmation. So when you do something that enhances your power, that brings you more status, that brings you more attention, that makes you feel good and strong and healthy, we call that action good. By contrast, the opposite of good is bad. And bad are actions that make you unhealthy, that make you powerless, that take your status in the community away from you, and that ultimately make you unhappy. And that is a term that Nietzsche uses for thinking about what is bad according to the chivalric aristocratic method. That which draws down your energies and makes you either literally or spiritually unhappy. Now, the thing about this noble system of valuation is that it is defined from the standpoint of the doer of the action and not the recipient. So if I do something like hit you over the head with a broom for no reason, I can say that the action is good because it made me feel strong. It made me feel powerless, independently of how it made you feel. And so the focus here on the source of the valuation is on the doer of the action, on the agent that performs. And that's why, to go back to the point about Paul Ray, Nietzsche says when Paul Ray and other people like him define morality from the standpoint of the recipient, they're already taken aside. And it means that they can't really see morality for what it really is in its historical progression. And so we need to step back and understand the distinction between nobility and, between noble morality and slave morality, which is precisely a difference between who gets to determine the moral value of an act. For the nobles, it's the doer. For slave morality, it is the recipient. Now, when we think about the morality of the Greeks, although for Nietzsche, it's not only the Greeks who have this noble morality, there are other cultures that also embody it. Nietzsche says, there are a few characteristics of this morality that we need to keep in mind lest we misunderstand it. The first thing is that even though the Greeks would engage in acts of power and self-affirmation at the expense of other people, he says it's not as if they didn't sympathize with the weak or with the conquered. It's just that they did not want to be that themselves, and they felt bad for them, but ultimately embraced their right to essentially affirm themselves through these acts of power enhancing activity. But it doesn't rule out the possibility of sympathizing with the weak. And so the nobles might sympathize with the weak and say, I'm sorry that you're weak. I'm sorry that you're unhappy. I wish that weren't the case, but I'm happy that I am powerful. And that brings with it what Nietzsche calls a healthy naivete about the power affirming acts of the nobles. So they do what they need to do with kind of healthy naivete. They don't have the kind of resentment or envy or jealousy of others that, as we will see, we find in the morality of the slave revolt. Now, the last thing I'll mention here in connection to the morality of the nobles is that it's not as if the nobles are immune from negative feelings, right? So even the Greeks would sometimes feel angry or vengeful, or they would want to get payback from others who wronged them. But the important thing for Nietzsche is that from the standpoint of the morality of the nobles, whenever you have a negative emotion, you have to consume that emotion in action. In other words, you have to do something about it. So let's say that somebody hits you over the head with a broom, because I'm sticking with that example from now until the end of this video. Imagine that somebody hits you over the head with a broom and you're feeling bad, you're feeling humiliated. Nietzsche says, grab the broom and hit back, or do something that will consume those negative feelings in the form of action. Grab the broom and break it over your knee, or grab the broom and throw it in the river. But what you cannot do is let the emotions simmer and grow and turn to poison. And that's a term that he uses in Treatise 1. He says, the problem with the morality of the slaves, which he associates with the Jews, and I'll talk about that in a second, is that it just sits there. And because it doesn't translate into action, it ultimately becomes a poison for the soul and for the body. And that poison function of morality is what you don't get with the morality of the noble. And so, just to summarize the noble morality, what you get here is a distinction between the good and the bad, where the good is the powerful, the healthy, the self-affirming, and the bad is the opposite of that. It's the weak, the powerless, and the self-denying. And this is a morality that translates into kind of healthy naivete. It doesn't have negative feelings towards others. It's just a happy self-affirmation through acts that sometimes involve producing suffering in others. Now, that's the morality of the noble. The other end of the equation is what Nietzsche calls the slave morality. And very problematically, as I'm sure many of you know, Nietzsche associates this just with the Jews. He says the Jews this, the Jews that. And that's part of why Nietzsche's works have been interpreted and misused in a number of ways after Nietzsche's death, because there are a lot of anti-Semitic tropes, anti-Semitic turns of phrase that Nietzsche uses, often in a sloppy and lazy way. But we need to understand what Nietzsche means by the word slave and by the Jews. So first things first, when Nietzsche talks about slave morality, it's important to note that he's not talking about enslaved people or their moral systems or their modes of thinking about the world. So he doesn't have in mind as a historical reference here the long and dark history of slavery itself. What he means, and he says this very clearly in Treatise 1, is when he talks about the Jews and the slaves, what he means are priests. He talks about the clerical caste, so the caste, the social caste made up of priests, and he also sometimes describes them as the priestly aristocracy. Now, who is the priestly aristocracy? Here we're talking about spiritual leaders, rabbis, priests, ministers, depending on your particular religious worldview. We're talking about spiritual leaders who occupy a position of social and economic power in the community. We're not talking about poor, dispossessed individuals. We're thinking about people who have a lot of power, material power, cultural power, social power, and who wield that power through claiming to be the spiritual guides of the community. So think about a wealthy priest who is associated with maybe like a church that owns a lot of land. That's what Nietzsche means by the slave morality. So don't think about slavery as an economic political institution. Think about slavery as a mode of valuation, because that's the way in which Nietzsche talks about it. And that's why I say that his use of the term the Jews and slaves is sloppish and somewhat not productive. But he does clarify that he's talking about this particular place where the aristocracy meets the clerical class. And that's what he means by that. Now, what defines slave morality understood in this way? Well, according to Nietzsche, the slave revolt in morality occurred when the slaves, i.e., the priests with a lot of money and economic influence, decided to completely reimagine the very meaning of morality. In particular, the morality of the noble. So they take the morality of the nobles and they institute two displacements or two redefinitions of value. The first one, according to Nietzsche, is that they redefine the very nature or the very meaning of what is good. Remember, for the nobles, what is good is what embraces me, what feels good, what enhances my power. So it is all about the enhancement of the self. Now, with the rise of this Jewish Christian morality, what is good is something completely different. It's actually what used to be considered bad. Now, what is good, and you can think about the Christian virtues, is to be weak, to be humble, to turn the other cheek, to not desire too much. All those things are suddenly indicators of moral value, and they are triggers of moral praise. And so, under the moral valuation of the slaves or the priests, to be good, paradoxically, means to be weak, which used to be what was bad in the noble system. So that's the first transvaluation, that the very meaning of the good is inverted or turned upside down. The second displacement that the slave revolt brings about, according to Nietzsche, is that it's not just that the meaning of the word good changes, is that its opposite is transformed into something else. So for the nobles, the opposite of good was bad, but suddenly the word good has a new opposite or a new enemy. And the enemy of the good is no longer the bad, it's that which is evil. So under the Greeks, you had a polarity between the good and the bad. Suddenly, you have a polarity between good and evil. And that means that for Nietzsche, it is only with the slave revolt and immorality that the very concept of evil emerges and is introduced into our vocabulary. So that's the essence of the slave revolt in morality. And this is what gives rise, according to Nietzsche, to this infatuation in the Judeo-Christian worldview for pursuing the good and fighting evil. And he has wonderful language for talking about the effects that this double displacement ultimately has on the lives of individuals. And what are those effects? First and foremost, it means the end of sympathy for one's opponent. Recall that the nobles, they wanted to enhance their power, but not necessarily for the sake of other people losing. They felt bad that other people lost, but too bad. They sympathized with them. They just cared more about themselves than about others. That possibility of sympathy for one's opponent is completely taken off the table once the slave revolt in morality is carried out. Because suddenly you don't relate to your enemies or to your arch nemesis or to your opposite through sympathy. You relate to them through judgment, right? Christians judge those that they deem evil, and they do not sympathize with them. So interestingly, even though Christians take themselves to be pro-social and good and to be motivated by positive feelings, Nietzsche says, isn't it weird that you are way more brutal to the people that you consider not good, i.e. evil, than even the brutal nobles were to the people that they considered not good, i.e. bad. So that's the first effect, and that is that sympathy actually gets taken out of the moral table of sentiments. The second thing that happens is that individuals who embrace this morality, they don't become actors. They only react. It is a fundamentally reactive system of morality in which individuals don't actually consume negative emotions in the fire of action. And that's why I said earlier that when you don't act, it can turn, your system of moral valuation can actually turn into a poison. It can simmer and it can boil inside you and it can eat you alive from within. And that's precisely what Nietzsche says, that because the priests are a fundamentally reactive class of people, they never do things, right? They just wait for things to happen to them, and then they simmer in ressentiment. This is where Nietzsche's term ressentiment comes in, because it is a fundamentally negative emotion rooted in suspicion for others. That means that the priest acts as if they are holier than thou, but deep down they are just brewing with anger, with jealousy, with regret for all the things that they should have done, but couldn't actually do, because their system of moral values tells us that to be good is to be weak, to be powerless, to be meek, to turn the other cheek. So you have this class of people, the priestly aristocratic class, that is receiving actions, can only react, but can only react by further abasing and further humiliating themselves in order to show their virtue. And that creates a toxic combination of spiritual elements for Nietzsche that gives rise to this condition of ressentiment. And there's a really beautiful passage in Treatise 1 where Nietzsche says, this combination of elements, this slave revolt in morality, produces a priest-like character whose soul is constantly squinting. So squinting like with the eyes. And I've always really liked this passage because when you think about somebody squinting, like people squint with suspicion, with anger, and you know that there's something that they want to say, but that they are not saying. And it's behavior that gets trapped inside the body without being translated into manifested action, but that again is poisoning the individual from within. And you can read that all from the squinting of the eyes. And so the priest, the representative of the slave morality, is fundamentally a squinting subject. That's the most they can do. They can't react. They can't stand up for themselves. They can't say what they really want. So they squint. And so Nietzsche says that all of this produces a kind of poison. Sorry, I got stuck there a little bit. That has two different faces to it. It is definitely a spiritual poison in the sense that it poisons the priest themselves, the individual, and makes them hate everything. It makes them hate the world, and makes them hate their own body. That's why Christian priests, according to Nietzsche, denied the world, constantly thinking that they're going to go to this otherworldly domain, heaven, that is beyond this world, because this world is a world of corruption. And that's also why they hate their natural animalistic impulses, like their impulse for power, their impulse for sex. They deny the body, they deny the pleasures. And all of this means that they're just squinting both at the world and at themselves. Now, the poison also has another face to it, though. So you have the spiritual side, which is about our relationship to the world and our relationship to ourselves. But Nietzsche says that it also has a larger cultural side effect that affects the entire community and not just the priest. So the priest poisons himself, but in so doing also poisons the entire social bond, the entire fabric of social life. And the reason for this is because once the values of the priest spread in society enough, and you have a Christian culture or a Christian society, or at least a society with a Christian system of values like ours, it means that the whole culture will have an extremely diminished view of human life, where human life means kneeling, abasing yourself, and constantly seeking to be downtrodden, if that makes sense. So Nietzsche really worries that once that's our view of what it means to be a good person, that it will actually bring about a deep, existential, widespread disillusionment with ourselves. Is that what it means to be a human? Just to go around getting hit over the head with brooms and then asking for further hits on the head with a broom as a way of virtue signaling? Is that what it means to exist? And if the Christian worldview is correct, it means that human beings are actually really sad, fundamentally uninteresting creatures. And it means that we cannot have faith in ourselves as a community or individually to achieve anything great, to achieve anything interesting. In fact, we're so flat and one-dimensional that we don't even get to surprise ourselves. And this is where Nietzsche connects this history of the slave revolt in Christianity, or the slave revolt in morality, where the slave morality overtakes and kicks out the noble morality, to the problem of nihilism that he thinks of as the central problem for philosophy. And he says the reason that people are nihilistic is because there is nothing to believe in anymore. We cannot even believe in our own humanity because our own humanity has been made so insignificant by Christianity. And that's where part one sort of comes to a close, by Nietzsche talking about the distinction between these two systems of moral valuation, and then suggesting that because one of them has become the dominant moral code of conduct, it has completely ruined and poisoned the way in which we feel about our bodies, about the world, about ourselves, and about humanity. And that poisoning is the root of contemporary nihilism.